Black Lives Matter, a slogan that has undoubtedly made people more conscious of race. While some believe that increased race consciousness leads to increased empathy, others would argue that an excessive focus on race defies Dr. Martin Luther King's ideas of colorblindness. Is Black Lives Matter the civil rights movement of our generation? Or does it push a false narrative that has created more harm than good? Is Black Lives Matter actually helping the Black community?
So let's not.
I want us to have perspective and talk about what's important, but you won't do that.
Oh no! Well, you don't get to decide what's important. You don't. We all have opinions here. I made a comment. I wanted you to respond to it, but I'll respond to your comment.
You think the problem of unarmed black people is a major problem in America, and I don't.
The idea of disagreement within the Black community concerning the advancement of blacks isn't new. In the late 1800s, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois emerged with starkly different strategies for blacks' social and economic success. Washington's idea was that blacks could elevate themselves through hard work and the acquisition of in-demand skills. Du Bois, on the other hand, advocated for political action and the passage of civil rights reform. While these men had very different focuses, they both agreed to varying degrees with one another, as Washington, for example, secretly financed efforts for political reform. A major setback for Washington's vision of economic prosperity occurred in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when white mobs burned over 35 square blocks of black businesses. At the time, this was the wealthiest black community in the United States, as it was nicknamed Black Wall Street. This event is known as the Tulsa Massacre, and it has been called the single worst incident of racial violence in history. Following the New Deal and the post-World War II economic boom, almost a quarter of black men were in white-collar or skilled manual occupations, and another 24% had semi-skilled factory jobs that meant membership in the stable working class, while the proportion of black women working as servants had been cut in half. From 1940 to 1970, black men cut the income gap by about a third, and by 1970 they were earning roughly 60% of what white men took in. Black life expectancy went up dramatically, as did black homeownership rates. Black college enrollment also rose, by 1970 to about 10% of the total. Du Bois's philosophy of civil disobedience and protest led into the civil rights movement and ultimately the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Following this legislation, the black-to-white ratio in men's average wages increased tremendously from 1965 to 1975. However, this economic progress did not continue into the 1980s and beyond, which is an important point that we will explore as we evaluate the BLM movement. Black Lives Matter began as a Twitter hashtag following the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman was a neighborhood watchman who claimed to be acting in self-defense. However, public opinion on this case became very polarized. The police shooting of Michael Brown followed shortly after, causing protests and riots in Ferguson, Missouri. These protests and riots continued for similar cases, and in the case of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, the National Guard was called in to restore order after the police were acquitted. Black Lives Matter has a variety of policy positions that we will address, but since its inception, I think that it's safe to say that its primary focus has been police shootings of black people.
The Black Lives Matter movement was started because it was talking about police brutality. If you want an all Black Lives Matter movement that talks about gun violence in communities, including, black communities, then start that movement with that name.
So what are the actual numbers of police killings of black people? According to numbers from the Washington Post, there have been roughly 1,000 fatal police shootings each year for the past 5 years. It's important to note that the Post data does not include deaths of people while in police custody, fatal shootings by off-duty officers, or deaths not caused by firearm. So cases like Eric Garner or George Floyd would not be included. According to the data, 45% of the victims have been white, 24% black, and 17% Hispanic. Roughly 94% of the victims were armed and extremely dangerous, and the amount of unarmed blacks killed by police shooting in 2019 was 10. In 5 of these deaths, the officer was attacked. In one case, the officer's gun went off during a struggle with the suspect. The other 4 occurred during a pursuit or standoff, and in 2 of these cases, the officer received criminal charges. So according to the stats, more whites, both armed and unarmed, are killed by police than blacks in absolute numbers. However, these numbers have created somewhat of a Rorschach test, as some will note that blacks only make up 13% of the population, therefore they are disproportionately killed in police shootings. But others will rebuttal with the fact that black perpetrators accounted for roughly 53% of murders in 2018. Therefore, it's likely that they have a disproportionately high rate of violent encounters with police. This would be like one person saying men are disproportionately killed by police, but another giving a rebuttal that men commit far more crime than women.
You're supposed to talk about the fact that black people are killed by cops disproportionately to our numbers in the population. But then again, you can also say that poverty makes you more likely to encounter the cops. And black people are disproportionately likely to be poor for unpardonable reasons. That, like we're talking about, there are larger issues here that people are justifiably upset about.
In 2016, an economist at Harvard named Roland published a paper on the topic of racial bias in both police use of force and police shootings. Fryer concluded that while there was evidence that police disproportionately used force on African Americans, there was no evidence of racial bias in police shootings, as blacks and Hispanics were even a bit less likely to be shot relative to whites.
In that data, we find no racial differences no matter what we do with the data, okay? And I just want to be clear about something else. This was a surprise to me, partly because of my own lived experience, partly because of the part A of the paper. We had 8 full-time research assistants who gathered that data. Police reports in officer-involved shootings come as 50-page documents. We took that and transformed that into 200 explanatory variables, etc. Okay? After we did that and we found this result, we hired 8 new research assistants, gave them the raw data, and had them coded up again, just to ensure. Okay?
So who are these whites killed by police? Why have we never seen them? A particularly disturbing case was the 2016 shooting of an unarmed white man named Daniel Shaver. It should be noted that the police officer was cleared of all charges and reinstated to the Mesa Police Department. Viewer discretion is advised.
You are to put both of your hands palms down, straight out in front of you. Push yourself up to a kneeling position. I said keep your legs crossed! Put your hand! Hands up in the air! You do that again, we're shooting you, do you understand? Then listen to my instructions! Don't talk, listen! Don't talk!
Is it possible that there could be a problem with police shootings, but not necessarily on the basis of race? The US has the highest rate of police shootings amongst developed countries in the entire world. However, when you divide each country's police shooting rate by their murder rate, this gap closes quite a bit, putting the US on par with Canada. While this is not the most scientific methodology, it is an important point to note.
You cannot tell me that if that was a white woman who was asleep, the police came in her house, fired 20 shots, that there would be no accountability, no indictments for the murder of that woman.
So 5 years ago, a white man named Derek Cruz, in a very similar situation, no-knock warrant, they shot him in the face, completely unarmed. What that tells me is there's a much deeper issue than racism. There's a reflexive urge to go to the race issue. I understand it, but the truth is that police in generally do not get punished for misbehavior. Taking into account the possibility of a policing problem in the United States, there is a factor that has made addressing this more complicated. Roland Fryer's research shows evidence of what is now referred to as the Ferguson Effect.
Investigations that happen when there are preceded by a viral incident, right? So there's social unrest, you go in and you investigate. So examples of that are Ferguson, Chicago, Baltimore, Riverside in the 90s, etc. Those cases are associated with large increases in homicide and total crime. And when I say large, I mean very large.
The Ferguson Effect describes the phenomenon of a spiking murder rate that has occurred every time a city's police department comes under intense national media scrutiny. It is presumed that the national media scrutiny causes the police to pull back, out of fear of becoming the next YouTube sensation. After the Michael Brown shooting in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, the murder rate spiked nearly 500%. In Baltimore, after the Freddie Gray shooting, the murder rate spiked nearly 75% and has stayed there ever since. In Minneapolis, the violent crime rate rose by 21% in 2020 following the death of George Floyd. A study by Vox found that from 2014 to 2019, cities that saw large BLM protests had 300 less police killings over that 5-year span. However, they also had an increase of 6,000 murders. While there may be other factors at play, this pattern of the Ferguson effect seems like far too much of a coincidence to have no validity.
Officer sees hand to hand and say, I'm not gonna care more than the community does. Because it takes a lot, man, for you to risk life and death every day, putting your family through that, and you wanna, at the end of the day, you wanna get your pension. And you lose your pension over something you did correctly, over something that you were justified in doing, but because the community became outraged, you lose it all.
One of the main solutions put forward to try and combat the problem of police misconduct has been the movement to defund the police. What does this mean? It depends who you ask.
Yes or no, will you commit to defunding Minneapolis Police Department?
Abolition of it?
What did I say? We don't want no more police.
No
Is
more.
that clear?
I do not support full abolition of the police. All right!
Don't waste our time!
Get the out of here!
I think that a big part of this conversation really is about reimagining how we do public safety in America.
I represent a community that has a high level of gun violence. I have a high level of gang activity. And so how do I go back and tell the seniors in my district or, just your everyday hardworking New Yorker that have to wake up in the morning, we don't need police. We need to abolish all police officers. We'll be okay. We're going to figure this out. I can't tell half of my constituents that because that's not what they want to see. In fact, some of them want to see more police.
So how much public support does the idea of defunding the police have? According to a Gallup poll from July 2020 that had 36,000 respondents, there were only 19% of Black respondents who said that police should spend less time in their area. While polls consistently show low support for defunding the police, they do show an overwhelming majority of support for police and criminal justice reform, especially pertaining to the drug war.
To take all policing off is something that I think a latte liberal may go for as they sit around the Hamptons discussing this as some academic problem. But people living on the ground need proper policing. Yes.
When you look in the city of Chicago, there are 9 children who died by gun violence, by black on black gun violence, from June 20th all the way to today. And you're talking about even with the Atlanta child murders, there were 28 kids who died in 2 years. You're talking about a month, and you have 9 black kids, and the Black Lives Matter movement has said nothing.
A common rebuttal to the Black Lives Matter movement is the question of why they don't seem to care about inner city violence, or as some people call it, black on black violence. To get an idea of the significance of this problem, let's take Baltimore as an example. Baltimore has the 11th highest murder rate per capita in the entire world. Its murder rate is higher than El Salvador, the country with the world's highest murder rate. More people have been killed in the last 10 years in Baltimore than the amount of US soldiers killed in Afghanistan. In 2015, a girl named Arnisha Bowers was strangled, raped, and then her genitals were set on fire in a gang initiation killing. Each year, the overwhelming majority of the perpetrators and victims of murders in Baltimore are Black. To conclude this point, Lieutenant Alan West contextualizes this data by saying that more Blacks are killed by other Blacks each year than the KKK killed in 86 years.
Listen, there's crime. There are people in those communities those people aren't just being nonchalant about gun violence. I lived in Chicago. There are many people who are working in those communities to try to get rid of the gun violence.
Actually, Don Lemon is right that there are people working on solving these problems. Let's take the example of Erica Bridgeford. She began what is now known as Baltimore Ceasefire Weekends. In February of 2018, Baltimore experienced almost 12 straight days of no homicides, something that hadn't happened in years. What Don Lemon leaves out is the fact that people like Erica Bridgeford get next to no coverage from the mainstream media or BLM. Is there a problem with policing on the basis of race? Or is there just a policing problem but not a race problem? If this problem exists, what is the magnitude of it? Is it correlated to the crime rate? What is the best way to address the problem in a way that avoids a potential spike in violent crime? Why is Black Lives Matter so fixated on this issue in particular and not the larger issue of high crime rates?
You know what I noticed? Nobody panics when things go according to plan. Even if the plan is horrifying. If tomorrow I tell the press that like a gangbanger will get shot, or a truckload of soldiers will be blowing up, nobody panics. Because it's all part of the plan. But when I say that one little old mare will die, well, then everyone loses their minds.
Virtue signaling, the action or practice of publicly expressing opinions or sentiments intended to demonstrate one's good character or the moral correctness of one's position on a particular issue.
I take responsibility.
I take responsibility.
I take responsibility.
I take responsibility for every unchecked moment.
For every time it was easier to ignore than to call it out for what it was.
Every not-so-funny joke. Every unfair stereotype.
The first time that I remember seeing widespread virtue signaling was during the KONY 2012 campaign. This was the first YouTube video ever to reach 1 million likes, and the flood of popularity caused its website to crash. The purpose of this video was to expose a Ugandan warlord named Joseph KONY who had been terrorizing the region and recruiting child soldiers. The response to this was mixed, to say the least. This documentary was accused of grossly oversimplifying the situation. KONY's army, the Lord's Resistance Army, had been out of Uganda for 6 years, and there were reports that there was a significant rise in kidnappings.
Well, I think we have to recognize that ultimately Invisible Children is calling for a military intervention by the U.S. and others, and that military intervention was tried before. It was tried before. Back in 2008, it was called Operation Lightning Thunder, reported well in the New York Times and elsewhere, where the U.S. using military forces went in and working with the Ugandan militaries. What we saw essentially was Ugandan civilians caught in the crossfire, huge escalation in deaths at that time.
After the initial boom in interest when it was socially popular to be interested, the KONY 2012 campaign ended up fizzling out. Another major example of virtue signaling came in 2015 during the Charlie Hebdo attacks, when many people changed the backgrounds of their Facebook profile pictures to the French flag. There had been an attack that was almost identical that happened in Beirut just hours before the Paris attack, but there was very little coverage or empathy. It was clear in this case that the masses expressed outrage when it was socially rewarded.
There's this old saying from the New Testament about not praying in public, right? And the idea is that if you're going to commune for the higher good, you should do it in private, because otherwise you're warping your ethic in some sense by demonstrating how virtuous you are to the world. It's like, you know, you go out there with a stick and a sign on it that says, "I'm against poverty." It's like, yeah, no kidding, man. Really. Like, who's for poverty? No one's for poverty. So it's an abdication of responsibility with the mask of social virtue.
The documentary The Social Dilemma goes into detail on the mental effects of likes and validation and concludes that social media is far more addictive than any drug. But so what if people are virtue signaling? Even if this slacktivism is mostly self-serving, does it really matter if it's still pushing a good cause? Well, yes, it does matter. Like in the case of KONY, the solution that is promoted might end up hurting the same people that it is claiming to help.
Property damage is nowhere near as important as physical loss of life. Protesters are right to be speaking out.
The idea that you could have a few people who break a few windows and burn a few cars.
They don't know what to do with that emotion, so their response, especially young folks, is to lash out.
Is not generally speaking unruly, but fires have been started.
And please,
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
Some activists promoted nonviolence. Others claimed to promote nonviolence to provide plausible deniability, and others outright promoted violence. No one has taken responsibility for the fallout of this violence. Insurance companies have taken up to $2 billion in losses from the riots. This sounds like a lot, but it is not that much compared to natural disasters and the fires in California. However, 75% of U.S. businesses are underinsured and 40% have no insurance at all. Businesses will have higher insurance rates and lower property values. Because of the businesses that were destroyed, there will be reduced tax revenue, less economic opportunity, and more urban blight. The violent crime rate spiked in many cities that had large protests. There were also nearly 24 people who died in the George Floyd riots, including David Dorn, David Patrick Underwood, Oscar Lee Stewart, John Tiggs, and Chris Beatty, amongst many others. It is often said that violence is more effective in bringing about positive social change. However, many times violence can lead to even worse outcomes, such as the reign of terror that followed the French Revolution, Stalin's gulags that followed the Russian Revolution, or Mao Zedong's Great Famine following the Communist Revolution. In every case, these revolutions sounded like noble causes of the oppressed, rising up against the oppressor. When innocent people are killed, the line between revolution and terrorism starts to blur.
Wokeness has robbed many a people of compassion and replaced it with moral superiority. Sometimes identity politics can run the risk of playing what they call the oppression Olympics, and who has it worse off and who suffered most. And if you have privilege, that means your life has been inherently good, which is very oversimplified notions of anyone's existence, which are not true.
While support for BLM started high, it has steadily declined following prolonged riots. Many people are also fatigued from being lectured on social media or from celebrities or sports figures. So what is the best way to go about changing hearts and minds?
There is this sense sometimes of the way of me making change is to be as judgmental as possible about other people. And that's enough. Like if I tweet or hashtag about how you didn't do something right, or used the wrong verb, or then I can sit back and feel pretty good about myself. Because man, you see how woke I was? I called you out. That's not activism. That's not bringing about change. You know, if all you're doing is casting stones, you know, you're probably not going to get that far. That's easy to do.
In contrast to this idea of wokeness that President Obama talks about, there is Daryl Davis, the black man famous for going to Klan meetings and befriending the members.
And I believe in separation of the races. I believe that's in the best interest of all races.
Does he really? Or has friendship transcended the color barrier? Listen to Kelly at a Klan rally.
I will follow right man to hell and back, because I believe in what he stands for and he believes in what I stand for. A lot of times we don't agree with everything, but at least he respects me to sit down and listen to me. And I'll respect him to sit down and listen to him.
Roger Kelly quit the Ku Klux Klan, and when he did, he gave me his robe and hood.
Then there's the story of Michael Kent, the former neo-Nazi who became close friends with his black parole officer.
She gave me a chance and it opened my eyes.
You two are unlikely friends.
Yes.
And of course, hate can go both ways.
Race was very different to me before I got saved. I saw black and white very clearly. I took Africana studies in college, and there was a period of time where I hated white people. Everything in my life was Afrocentric. I got to college and my eyes were opened up to a certain degree, because now everybody's white. And it's like 35 of us, you know, it's a little more than that. Probably about a couple hundred, but most of us were athletes.
Yeah.
And so I begin to see, like, you know, white people aren't as evil as I thought they were.
So they weren't.
There's no mystery to me as to why Jesse Jackson says what he does, or Al Sharpton and others, because that benefits them, but it does not benefit the people they lead. And all the incentives are for leaders to lead people into things that don't help the people, but help the leaders.
What you'd create there would be an exception for Dr. King, though, wouldn't there?
Yes, but
he was different because he was earliest, or what? Why? What's different about it?
Well, it's like insurgent movements in general. When an insurgency starts off, by definition, it has an uphill battle. Now, and you can look at the history of Christianity, for heaven's sake. If you're going to be a Christian in the Roman Empire, before in the first century, you had a lot of grief to go through. Now, but after Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, this is a bonanza.
So who are these race hustlers that Booker T. Washington and Thomas Sowell are talking about? The name most commonly thrown around is Al Sharpton, who first gained notoriety during the Tawana Brawley rape case. This case of an alleged rape was dismissed due to overwhelming evidence that Brawley had fabricated her story, and as a response, Sharpton accused the prosecutor of being one of the rapists and also of racism. Sharpton was sued for defamation and ordered to pay nearly $400,000, which he never did. He has become a fixture at every funeral for victims of high-profile police shootings. In his book Black Lives Matter, Talib Starks refers to Al Sharpton as Shakedown Sharpton and theorizes that he has enriched himself by threatening companies with bad publicity if they didn't financially support his agenda. Starks mentions dozens of companies such as Macy's, Pfizer, and Colgate-Palmolive who have shelled out thousands of dollars to Sharpton's charity in order to shield them from being publicly demonized as racist. Sharpton's charity pays him a salary of close to $500,000 a year.
The racial grievance industry, they pretend to want to help, but really what they're doing is hurting under the guise of racial harmony, but it's really racial disharmony. They're the ones who show up. They set these racial infernos and then show up as firemen.
In September, it was discovered that an Atlanta activist had spent $200,000 on a home and personal expenses. BLM co-founder Patrisse Cullors recently bought a $1.4 million house in LA. While there isn't evidence that she used donation money to buy this, she has benefited greatly from book sales and speaking gigs since starting BLM. The diversity training industry has been raking in billions of dollars, and in 2018, Indeed reported that postings for diversity and inclusion professionals had risen 35% in the previous 2 years. The mainstream media outlets have made a killing off of waging culture wars, as Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, and Rachel Maddow led the way for astronomical cable news ratings this past summer. Also due to many newspapers now having subscription-based business models, the storyline of racism has become a reliable way to attract new readers.
When a story involves a black victim and a white suspect, mainly if it's a white cop, journalists make a point to specify that the victim was black. But in the reverse, when the victim is white, race doesn't seem as important. In my opinion, the reason media outlets do this is to incite an emotional response from the public. And because so many black Americans haven't quite abandoned their obsession with righting the wrongs of slavery, I believe that the media finds these folks to be easy prey. And by the way, don't hurt the messenger, I'm just paraphrasing something that Manning Johnson, a black man, wrote in his book.
Ask yourself, who are you protesting for? Is it for those who have been oppressed, or is it for your own ego by trying to make yourself look morally superior? Have the effects of the protests been a net positive or a net negative? What is the magnitude of violence needed for violent protests to become considered terrorism? How significant of a role has the Grievance industrial complex played in shaping the narrative of racism?
Which boys you talking about? Which ones you talking about? I come down on Bertier, I don't see you coddle him. Come down on Sunshine, don't see you grab his hand, take him off to the side. Which boys you talking about? Now, I may be a mean cuss, but I'm the same mean cuss with everybody out there on that football field. The world don't give a damn about how sensitive these kids are, especially the young black kids. You ain't doing these kids a favor by patronizing them.
crippling them. You're crippling them for life.
Instead of separate but equal, there is separate and forgotten. I will confront another form of bias, the soft bigotry of low expectations. No child in America should be segregated by low expectations, imprisoned by illiteracy, abandoned to frustration and the darkness of self-doubt.
President Bush coined this term that describes the societal patronizing of African Americans in the name of compassion.
I think voter ID laws are a way to perpetuate racism.
Would you go as far as to say those laws are racist?
For sure.
Do you think it suppresses the African American vote?
Definitely. Because they're less likely to have state IDs.
Minority voters are less likely to have the kinds of IDs that have been described or required.
These type of people don't live in areas with easy access to DMVs or other places where they can get identification.
Do you have ID normally? Do you carry ID around?
Yes, I have state ID.
Do you carry ID?
Yes, I do.
Do you know any black person who doesn't carry ID?
No. Everyone that I know has an ID. Why would they think we don't have ID?
I have my ID and my friends have their ID, so we know what we need to carry around.
Everybody that I know have ID. Like, that's one of the things you need to walk around with New York with.
And I also heard a lot that black people, especially poor black people, have no access to the internet, can't figure out how to use the internet.
That's just stupidity, honestly. Everybody has access to the internet. Even a little kid can figure out how to work the internet.
I had access to the internet for years.
You know how to use it properly, right?
Exactly. I do it at work. So, of course, I know how to use it. My kids know how to use it. They all have iPads, iPods, whatever.
Your phone has data? Mm-hmm. You can actually
unlimited.
This soft bigotry extends to education, as anti-racist advocate Ibram X. Kendi has argued that standardized tests such as the SATs are biased against black and brown people, and has described them as a racist weapon to prevent minorities from attending Ivy League schools. With this being said, one is left to wonder how international students get into Ivy League universities, as their acceptance rate is about 5%, which is roughly 2 to 4% lower than their American counterparts. Even with their low acceptance rates, international students make up a significant share of the Ivy League population. Further on the topic of education, a report called Project Baltimore has recently found that 5 high schools and 1 middle school in Baltimore did not have one student who was proficient on the state math and English exams. With this being said, the high school graduation rate in Baltimore is still around 70%, which indicates that the standards for graduation have plummeted. This is even more apparent when looking at data from Baltimore City Community College, where 93% of students need to take non-credit remedial courses.
I am very happy that I received virtually all of my education before it became fashionable for white people to like black people. Now, what I mean by that is that when I earned a C in high school or in college, that was a real, honest-to-God C that I earned. And when I earned an A, that was a real, honest-to-God A that I earned. Those people did not care about the legacy of discrimination. They didn't care about my handicaps of being poor. They held me up to standards.
Black people can't learn the same way as other groups, so they have to have this special treatment. And when I went to college, I started in the 70s, I was in graduate school in the 1980s, we were given an equal opportunity. We were admitted to colleges and universities, and we had to do the work.
I'm saying if you really cared about racial equality, I could go on in this vein, the affirmative action debate. We are now and I'll stop because I know our time is limited, but we're now on the verge of enshrining as a permanent device achieving the inclusion and representation of African Americans in elite and selective academic venues through an openly acknowledged use of different standards to judge their performance. That's horrible. It's not horrible because of the 14th Amendment, although the Supreme Court may yet find so. It's horrible because it really isn't equality. It's patronization. It's African Americans embracing and the establishment adopting a set of practices that basically are rooted in the soft bigotry of low expectations.
There are long existing stereotypes on race and school performance, usually placing Asians at the top of the pack. It is sometimes considered racist to assume that Asians will perform among the top academically, but it begs the question of how much of a role culture plays in determining these outcomes. There is also the question of the type of behavior society expects from various races, and how this perpetuates toxic cultural elements. In other words, are low expectations for certain races being disguised as compassion?
Why do you think kids didn't want to grow up going to school? Because going to school, you became a nerd. It's like they don't respect you. Like, oh, look at you. You could just tell even when it comes to people coming home from jail compared to somebody that's coming home from college. You see the difference in love and respect. And you know who gets it? The guy that comes home from jail.
If a white rapper explicitly rapped about killing white people, we'd say they're mentally ill. If a white rapper explicitly rapped about killing black people, we'd say they're a Nazi. If a black rapper explicitly raps about killing black people, they might go platinum. Why is that? Society as a whole, this includes both black people, white people, all people, as a society, through the mainstream media, through the entertainment industry, through radios, DJs, clubs, everything. Certainly when it comes to music, when it comes to entertainment, even when it comes to the real world, we have become numb to the idea of black people killing each other.
For almost the entirety of the civil rights movement, the goal was to have equality of opportunity between all of the races. In the age of BLM, these goals have changed, and now the goal is equality of outcome. When African Americans perform worse than whites in areas such as education, income, or home ownership, this is often attributed to systemic racism. But is this really an intellectually honest way to look at this?
There is a naive assumption that wherever there is a statistical gap in outcomes between two groups, that gap must be attributable to some kind of discrimination, whether that's overt or whether that's structural and systemic. That assumption is not true. Okay, I'll give one example, but I could give dozens. According to 2015 census figures, there's a 21 cent on the dollar gap. It's 21 cents on the dollar gap in household income between white Americans of Russian descent and white Americans of French descent, right? Disparity is the norm, not the exception.
There is another important point to examine. African Americans are not the only blacks in America. There are also many African and Afro-Caribbean immigrants. Black immigrants have lower poverty rates and higher household income and educational attainment than US-born blacks. It is important to note that there are disparities amongst black immigrants, as Nigerians are overrepresented in master's and doctor's programs.
Nigerians in particular are extraordinarily successful upon immigrating to America.
Yeah, I think it's a family thing. It's like when our families decide and we get the opportunity to move to a better place.
Right.
The thing is that the whole persona is, we're going to be able to sustain this forever. So my kids are not going to just play around in sports, because that's not guaranteed.
Right.
What is guaranteed is the fact that you're going to go to school and you're going to become a doctor, because you're going to get a job anywhere in the world that you want.
But there's a bigger picture way to test this systemic racism hypothesis, which is to take two populations where it's a very messy, crude science experiment, but to take two populations where you're holding systemic racism constant, namely black Americans like myself and black immigrants, especially black immigrants from the West Indies and their children. And you find wildly different outcomes. You find, rate of high school graduation much higher for black West Indians, rate of enrollment in college much higher, rate of professional occupations much higher, crime lower, right? So this suggests to me that that the role of systemic racism, to whatever degree it exists, is minimal.
So what exactly are the causes of these cultural differences that seem to contribute to this negative disparity? In Thomas Sowell's book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, he explains that negative elements of black culture actually originated in Scotland and Ireland, where many of the southern whites descended from. He argues that there were more differences between northerners and southerners than there were between blacks and whites. He notes that southern whites spoke differently, were far less productive, and far more violent than northern whites. He makes many parallels between the redneck culture of the Old South, or even earlier in the UK, and gang culture that exists in many black urban areas today.
If you look at the piece, for example, using the word axe for ask and stuff like that, all of that goes back to the South, and it goes back to the parts of Britain from which white Southerners came. So if you trace the calling hog entrails chitlins, that was in a certain section of Britain, the section from which whites moved into the South, and they were known as rednecks and crackers in Britain in centuries past, before they ever set foot in the South.
To back up Sowell's idea of blacks adopting white culture is the story of Liberia. Liberia was founded by the American Colonization Society, which was established by the Monroe administration in 1816. This was the movement to send free blacks back to Africa if they wanted to go. About 13,000 of them did. Liberia has stark similarities to the US, such as their flag, their capital of Monrovia being named after James Monroe, and they've even got a county called Maryland. More importantly, the former slaves adopted the culture of their white slave masters, as they built plantation-style houses, wore hoop skirts, and built Protestant churches and a Masonic lodge. They forced the indigenous people to work on their plantations, barred them from citizenship and voting, and prohibited marriage between native Liberians and Americo-Liberians. The native Liberians even referred to these former American slaves as whites. These former slaves that emigrated to Liberia had adopted both the culture and the behavior of their former white slave masters.
But when you're constantly being told that America is this racist labyrinth and there's a glass ceiling, and if you hear that as a kid and it's reinforced in school, it's reinforced, on social media, you begin to think, well, this is it. I might as well just not really try or maximize my potential, because wherever I go, the rug can be yanked from underneath me in America.
Is it really compassion trying to create different standards for African Americans, or is it patronizing? Should we strive for equality of opportunity or equality of outcome? Why do African and Afro-Caribbean immigrants perform better than US-born blacks? Are African Americans ostracized by their own community for acting white? How much do cultural differences contribute to different success rates?
My father's a Black Panther. My mother got arrested for the sit-ins at age 6. They were fighting for us to have the right to our opinion, not the right to vote for whoever the white liberals said Black people are supposed to vote for.
So he doesn't want to pay 62% of taxes because he doesn't want to go from being 50 cents to 20 cents. And I had to remind him that he was a Black person, so he can't vote for Donald Trump.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't Black.
After the end of the Civil War in 1865, African Americans overwhelmingly voted Republican because this party of Lincoln was the one that passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, abolishing slavery, guaranteeing equal protections, and giving voting rights. They remained loyal to the Republican Party for the next 60 years due to the goodwill built up during Reconstruction. However, the power of their vote was hindered by Jim Crow laws that prevented them from voting. The goodwill built up by the Republican Party was beginning to run out in the 1920s during the Great Depression, causing many blacks to defect from this party to vote for Franklin Roosevelt. Many blacks who voted Democrat during this election urged others to emancipate themselves from blind allegiance to the Republican Party. Some did, but many blacks chose the devil that they knew. After FDR won in 1932, he passed the New Deal legislation, which was not targeted at helping blacks specifically, but instead helping all Americans. By virtue of being American, this legislation greatly helped blacks, and FDR began to win over their support. In the election of 1936, African Americans had become a hotly sought-after constituency, but FDR and the Democrats ended up winning 75% of the black vote. FDR had taken further steps to make inroads with the black community and formed a black cabinet so he could remain up to date with issues in the black community. Both FDR and Truman consistently won about 75% of the black vote, But this came at the expense of the Southern white Democrats who still wanted segregation, people who came to be known as Dixiecrats. Republicans then won back some of the black community as Eisenhower got 39% in 1956 and Nixon got 32% in 1960. Following this, Lyndon B. Johnson got 94% of the black vote in 1964 due to his promise to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And since then, no Republican candidate has gotten more than 15% of the black vote.
Bo, we have a problem. Junior is a Republican. Ronald Reagan, Ann Coulter, Fox News, Tea Party, Bo, Republican!
Republican?
Yes!
No!
Yes!
No!
Yes!
No!
Yes!
We don't do that, Dre!
What's that you say? You say re? As in Republican?
Uh-huh.
No, it can't be a Republican! Oh my Not a Republican!
There are some prominent black Republicans such as Ben Carson, Burgess Owens, Tim Scott, and Lieutenant Allen West. But many African Americans describe the feeling of being ostracized within their own community when they quote-unquote come out as a conservative.
When I came out as conservative, they like to push forward this veneer of inclusion and tolerance, and that dropped like that. So it was the nastiest treatment that I had ever seen, and I never expected it.
For me, it started with my high school friends. Everybody was unfriending me on Facebook because, I was talking about the Trump election and I went to the inauguration and all of that. So and then it trickled down to my family. Aunts won't speak to me even now. I got aunts that don't talk to me because I want to be white.
So what does any of this have to do with Black Lives Matter? While they aren't an explicitly democratic organization, their website suggests very strongly that they are highly focused on political goals that align with the agenda of the Democratic Party. So what are these goals? Convict and ban Trump from future political office, expel Republican members of Congress who attempted to overturn the election, launch a full investigation into the ties between white supremacy and the Capitol Police, law enforcement, and the military, permanently ban Trump from all digital media platforms, don't let the coup be used as an excuse to crack down on our movement, and pass the Breathe Act. Out of these 7 demands, 3 of them are targeted at Republicans, with 2 of these 3 targeted at Trump in particular. But actually, there's more.
When people are asking me about Black Lives Matter, for instance, Black Lives Matter, the sentiment, I can get down with. Black Lives Matter, the organization, I cannot.
And why is that?
Because they are not for the same thing.
So what do you think?
The leader, the founders of Black Lives Matter literally just came out and basically said she's a trained Marxist. She didn't basically say, she said blatantly, she's a trained Marxist.
The founders of the Black Lives Matter movement have referred to themselves as trained Marxists. However, the movement is decentralized and has evolved over time. Nevertheless, there used to be policy positions on the BLM website that would be considered radical, such as reparations, independent black power or black nationalism of sorts, collective ownership, and the end of the nuclear family.
Black Lives Matter is a political statement, and there is a political program attached to it, and plenty of people, sort of broadly may not be aware of it, but the fact that it does have some roots in Marxism, that there are radical elements of the Black Lives Matter movement that are very disinclined towards free markets and capitalism, that challenge very basic notions that I think are broadly shared by Americans about equality under the law, for example. This pivot towards equity, racial equity, and a focus disproportionately on outcomes is something that is rather new, but seems to have taken the country by storm.
Let's focus on this last point about the end of the nuclear family. What BLM wants as an alternative is a community where everyone takes care of each other. But this idea of ending the nuclear family has raised lots of alarms because it has already been happening.
Lil Yummy was an 11-year-old murderer. Wow. And you look at his picture, you'll see the headshot of him, and he's like this. And he got murdered at 11 by a 14-year-old. Wow. Who's doing life now, and a 16-year-old. That makes no sense. You blame the system? Where was his father? It starts in the house. It starts in the home. And well, my father got locked up. Well, where was his father? Yeah.
In 1940, only 2% of white babies were born outside of marriage, and about 17% of black babies were. According to a 1965 Moynihan report, roughly 3% of white babies and 24% of black babies were born outside of marriage. However, according to a 2018 report, nearly 30% of white babies and 70% of black babies are born outside of marriage. This data tells me several things. First, the rate of black babies born outside of marriage had already been rising fairly significantly from the 40s to the 60s, but that rate wasn't rising as fast for whites. After the 1960s, this rate of single mothers skyrocketed for both races, but it flattened for blacks in 1995, whereas it has continued upwards for whites and Hispanics. This shows what many of us have known, that there has been a cultural shift amongst all races brought on by the 60s.
Our music has taken a hit. I go back and I listen to the music I grew up on, and I grew up in my grandfather's home. The Temptations, Diana Ross, music that was about love, feeling good, men that were dressed in suits. Now we have Cardi B. Cardi B's new song is the #1 song right now, right?
You don't like WAP?
Right, listen. I'm not, but think about what has happened to black culture
I rock with you.
from My Girl.
Yeah.
I've got Sunshine in a Clouded Day to WAP, which you wouldn't feel comfortable if I told you to read the lyrics right now for your show.
Another contributing factor to the decline of the black family has been the drug war and the opioid crisis, which has deprived many families of fathers. Another commonly mentioned factor was Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs of the 1960s. While the Great Society introduced programs like Medicare and Medicaid, many say that it incentivized unemployment, underemployment, and single mother homes. To further elaborate on this, the Illinois Policy Institute made some calculations. The potential sum of welfare benefits can reach nearly $48,000 annually for single-parent households and $41,000 for two-parent households. Welfare benefits will be available to some households earning as much as $75,000 annually. A single mom has the most resources available to her family when she works full-time at a wage of $8.25 to $12 an hour. Disturbingly, taking a pay increase to $18 an hour can leave her with about 1/3 fewer total resources. In order to make work quote-unquote pay again, she would need an hourly wage of $38 to mitigate the impact of lost benefits and higher taxes.
We should encourage marriage by removing the financial disincentives for couples who love one another, but may find it financially disadvantageous if they get married. We should reform our child support laws to get more men working and engaged with their children.
The poverty rate had been sharply declining from the 1940s to the 1960s because the Great Depression was coming to an end, and the US had become a manufacturing powerhouse, as almost the rest of the developed world had been decimated by the two world wars. However, since the mid-60s, the poverty rate has remained stagnant between 11 and 15%. This has led some to wonder whether the war on poverty was ever actually meant to help the black community, or instead create a reliable voting bloc for, as LBJ colorfully put it, the next 200 years.
Where did this happen to the black family? Because it wasn't always like this. So where do you go? How far do you have to go back to start making sense of how it got to this place?
Great Society and LBJ, because right before the Great Society and LBJ, black people, as far as couples and families, kids born in wedlock, I think it was 92% in around the early 60s. It dropped in the 70s to around 50%, and now only 24% of black children are born in wedlock. The number is astounding. And you look at right there where they started telling black women, well, if you work with the state, if you have children and there's no man there, we will compensate you.
BLM's policy to abolish the idea of the nuclear family in favor of what sounds like a commune has never succeeded even on a small scale in human history, and reminds many people of Venezuela or Cuba. The data on how a two-parent household affects a child's outcome is pretty clear. Children living with both biological parents are 20 to 35% more physically healthy than children from broken homes. Being raised in a married family reduced the child's probability of living in poverty by about 82%. According to Pew Research, over half of those living with married parents were in households with incomes at least 200% above the poverty line, compared with just 21% of those living in single-parent households.
I once interviewed a guy named Kwesi Mfume. He used to be the head of the NAACP. One of the few so-called black leaders I can get on my show. I've called Jesse 50 times, Al Sharpton 50 times, Maxine Waters 100 times, they won't come on. But Kwesi Mfume did come on. And I said, Mr. Mfume, As between the presence of white racism or the absence of black fathers, which poses the bigger threat to the black community? Without missing a beat, he said the absence of black fathers.
Political parties are based off of coalitions, and since 1964, the Democratic Party's most reliable coalition has been the black community. Because racism can't be quantified, each election a major part of their campaign can be fighting racism. The black electorate has largely operated as a monolith. However, black voters have a variety of policy positions and ideologically are not a monolith. What percentage of black voters align with the policy positions being pushed by BLM? How long will the Democratic stranglehold over the majority of the black community continue? Have the big government policies of the 60s helped or hurt the black community? What role has the breakdown of the black family played in hindering black progress?
I mean, 21% of blacks are below the poverty line. So that means we're giving checks to 80% of people who are not in poverty.
Do you think that race plays a part in wealth distribution, or either a mindset that you can't
Today?
or cannot? Yeah.
No.
You don't?
No, I don't. No. You and I, we're proof. Why would race have anything to do with it? Put your mind to what you want to do and go for that. It's kind of like religion to me. It's a good excuse for not getting there.
Yeah. It seems like every single day on television I'm talking about race, and it's because of the news cycle, it's in the news, but sometimes I get so tired of talking about it. I want to just go, this is over, can we move on?
And if you talk about it, it exists.
Right.
It's not like it exists and we refuse to talk about it, but making it a bigger issue than it needs to be is the problem we have.
Where are we in the United States of America in race relations, and what you see from day to day in your life?
Skip, they wouldn't want to ask me that. They wouldn't want my answer to represent it, because God knows I have been nothing but blessed. My whole path, these 33 years have been nothing but a blessing. I have never, never is a strong word, never dealt with racism. I'm glad I didn't have to.
To what capacity does racism exist today? Roughly 11% of our Congress is black, which nearly matches the percentage of the black population in the US. A former president is black, the vice president is black, a Supreme Court justice is black. Blacks are heavily overrepresented in sports and the arts. Black Panther is the 12th highest grossing film of all time, and it grossed more than any other Marvel film besides the Avengers films. Dr. Dre, P. Diddy, and Jay-Z combined are worth nearly $3 billion.
I remember one time I saw you after you had done a concert, I think it was in Westchester, different kind of neighborhood, but I asked you what the racial breakdown was of your audience. Do you remember this? And you told me the only black face you could see in the whole audience was your makeup artist. I believe that's what you said. She was in the front row, right? A lot of white kids love rap.
Yes.
Explain that. What does that say to you? What's the message of it? What's the bigger picture of it?
I don't want to be bashed, because I don't want to sound like I'm on the wrong if there is a side, but I thought that was clearly a message that there was no such thing as racism. That's what I thought that was.
Okay.
The truth is, we are in a very new era, and it's considered the height of enlightenment for both whites and blacks to pretend that that isn't true, and that's the problem that we have.
While the outlook for African Americans is typically portrayed in a way that looks bleak, there are quite a few statistics that paint a different picture. From 2001 to 2017, the incarceration rate for black men declined by 34%. Between 1999 and 2015, the mortality rate for black Americans aged 65 and over shrank by 29% for cancer, 31% for diabetes, and 43% for heart disease. All of those percentage drops were actually larger than the drops experienced by comparable whites over the same period. In 2017, black female life expectancy was 78.5 years, up from 75.1 years in 2000. Life expectancy for black men increased from 68.2 to 71.9 years over the same time span. Between 1999 and 2016, the number of black students who were in bachelor's degrees increased by 82%. Over the same period, the number of associate's and master's degrees awarded to black students more than doubled. If Black America were its own country, that would place it in between Germany and Spain in terms of educational attainment. The Federal Reserve recently reported that over 60% of blacks at every level of educational attainment say they're doing better financially than their parents, a higher percentage than either whites or Hispanics. And although black men still lag behind white men in terms of upward mobility, black women now go on to earn slightly higher incomes than white women from similar socioeconomic backgrounds. In 1940, 60% of employed black women worked as domestic servants. Today that number is down to 2.2%, while 60% hold white-collar jobs. In 1958, 44% of whites said they would move if a black family became their next-door neighbor. Today that figure is 1%.
The Harvard sociologist Ethan Foss has done extensive polling of the black community and found that disconnected black youth, which are black youth who aren't in schools and don't have jobs, the people on the lowest rung of society, something around 30% of them think the system is rigged and 70% don't. So what we're getting is we're getting the voices of black people who believe the systemic racism narrative promoted to the most powerful media positions in our country. So we're getting the impression that this is a uniform view, and it's not.
The black unemployment rate hit a record low of 5.5% prior to the COVID lockdowns. According to a Nielsen report, 90% of African American consumers live in a household with a smartphone, which is 6% higher than the total population. Blacks have about $1.5 trillion in spending power, meaning that if they were a country, their per capita income adjusted by purchasing power parity would rank right around Romania and Turkey. While there is still a wealth gap that exists between black and white, the wealth gap has increased between rich and poor of all races, creating more of a class struggle than a race struggle. Even though the wealth gap has increased, the quality of life for all American citizens has increased over the past several decades.
I truly believe in my heart most white people and black people are awesome people, but we're so stupid following our politicians, whether they are Republicans or Democrats. And their only job is, hey, let's make these people not like each other. We don't live in their neighborhoods. We're all got money. Let's make the whites and blacks not like each other. Let's make rich people and poor people not like each other. Let's scramble the middle class. I truly believe that in my heart.
Black Lives Matter, the most talked about social movement of our time. We look back on history and wonder how certain behavior could have been acceptable, and many times we judge the past with standards of today. In 50 years, when people look back on today, what kind of behavior will they think was unacceptable? Will Black Lives Matter be vindicated? Or is it counterproductive in causing division? Is Black Lives Matter helping the black community? What do you think?